I am here today with Anthony Meindl. Anthony Meindl founded his acting workshop over 20 years ago, yet is constantly adapting and evolving his insights about creativity into practical works for all artists. He has bridged the gap between artistry and rational consciousness. Love that phrase. We definitely have to talk about that.
Yes, we
He
can.
has
Yeah.
bridged the gap between artistry and rational consciousness and teaches how to incorporate the two in our work and in our lives. And I'll read a couple sentences from the rest of this as well. Beyond the 10 schools established around the world, Tony has guest taught at the David Lynch Masters in Filmmaking program, the Moscow Art Theater, and many other places. His scripts and films, which focus on socially conscious issues, have won numerous festival awards. His latest feature, Where Do We Go From Here, won awards and is out on Hulu. He's also got a podcast called In the Moment, and his first book, called At Left Brain, Turn Right, what a fantastic title, redefines creativity and how to access more of it in our lives. His latest book, so that was his first book, his latest book, You Knew When You Were Two, releases spring of 2020. Tony, yeah, the reason we got in touch or I contacted you was because of your expertise around identity. But before we get there, let's start with your bio. You talk about artistry and rational consciousness and bridging that.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
I've realized that I don't think a lot of acting, maybe methodologies, focus on awareness, consciousness. It's more heady things, and it's interesting that the head stuff is what gets actors. Just like in life, I get challenged by life when I overthink. So it's really trying to be in the work in a way beyond the intellect, the left brain cognitive. We need our left brain to understand things for sure, but that's not where creativity flows from. That's not where love flows from. How do we describe these things, right? Hope,
Yeah,
love, compassion. You were just talking about your son,
yeah,
and he had a boo-boo and hit his head, and like you're feeling it's the feeling part,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So I mean, that's kind of like, really, it's quite simple, really. It's like, Abraham Maslow he talked about the flow state, or being in the zone. And it's really about having a practical principles and steps to get there. And
Okay.
I think we're all hardwired. I mean, I know your work is about this as well. It's difficult, right? Because we have to use um, terms and concepts and explain something that is transcendental, but trying to understand, ephemeral, if you will, and yet really real. It's a real thing, right?
Yeah.
But using terms to help understand it, but then you have to transcend the term to have the experience of it.
Yeah. So how do you teach? So it sounds to me like
So hard.
there's
No, no,
this
no.
this right and left brain and kind of if we can go beyond just right or just left and kind of it bring them together somehow. Is that what you're talking
Yeah,
about?
I mean, my first book, At Left Brain Turn Right. Obviously, I'm not in any way suggesting that the left and right hemisphere are not interfacing and connected and
Right.
conversing back and forth, because they are, and we need
Right.
them both. But I'm using that as a metaphor for, and it's kind of true in the work that I've done with people for so long, and not just actors, anybody who wants to be creative. You have an inspired idea, you have an intuition, you have an aha, you wake up in the middle of the night and you're like, oh my God, I have a great idea for a novel.
Yeah.
And then the next morning, the left brain is telling you, well, that's stupid, or who would be interested in that, or,
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's from the practical in our daily lives and in the work, like creative work itself. How do you turn that part off and you just create?
Hmm.
And, I think living in the world that I live in Hollywood, it's also can be very challenging for artists, because how many billion people are there in the world? Everybody has a different subjective experience of what they think life is, right? And then in terms of business, what they think will be successful or commercial or people will want. And nobody knows. That's the great aha about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, my feeling, Anoop, is that when we get these, we're all plugged into whatever we want to call it. And when we get those ahas, the real work is to translate it from the spiritual, if you will, or if that's too highfalutin, translating it from somewhere into the physical.
Okay.
And that's hard. That takes work. That's the real creative process.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, the genesis of creativity is not hard because we're all very creative beings and we all have great ideas and we all have this extension and expression of ourselves creatively. But when this part gets involved, it's really, can I cuss on here?
Yeah, sure.
It's hard. It's hard. It's like a battle.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So how do you bring this into acting? How do you teach? I know that's a big question, but what are some of the
No, it's
approaches,
quite
or how do you
simple.
work with
Yeah.
actors?
I mean, at one level, it's just what you and I are doing right now. It's listening and talking, and it's really distilling it to these very simple. Again, the older I get, you know, I used to laugh at cliches, you know, the cliches that our parents would tell us,
Right.
you know,
Right.
and I can't think of one right now, but like, and you just roll your eyes. But then as you get older, you realize, oh, they're so true. Like
Yeah.
the foundation of life itself is so simple and inherently complex. So, and I also, you know, I'm a big climate, you know, advocate, activist, and I think it goes to show how everything is connected, and you pull one string or you mess with. We think we can be more complex than the inherent complexity,
Yeah.
and it fucks everything up,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
so from the most granular to the universal, I think that's what I try to break down in very understandable experiences or exercises. And
Yeah.
it's really based on listening and having an instinct. And again, how do we trust that the way we're all channels, right? And how do we, again, get out of our own way and let that full expression be manifest?
Hmm.
It's hard for people because we've all grown up, and I'm not, you know, it's not about blaming the educational system or our parents or religion, although we can, but like, you know, it's like, it's really untethering all those things
Yeah.
that have kept us from being these wild, beautiful selves. You have kids, so you
Yeah.
see the impulse of the child is what we have lost when we become adult.
Hmm.
I think it was Picasso who said adults are obsolete children.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
I
so
think so.
true.
I think so. I was talking with somebody a few days ago and mentioning how, when you're a child, you're allowed to have imaginary friends, but there's some age at which, the walls come up, say, that's not allowed anymore. Now you're
Mm,
4, or now you're
hmm
7, or now
hmm
you're 10. So cut that out and live in this fragment or this
mm,
fraction of reality.
hmm
Not that
hmm
this isn't real, but it's not all of it. And it starts to create that divide in the mind. That's not okay. This is okay.
Separation. You're
Yeah.
right. But Anoop, I would also go so far as to say you use the word imaginary, and I know you probably understand it's imaginary to us because we don't perceive or tap into or process what kids might be connected to,
Yeah.
which is a whole other, it's like nature, right?
Yeah.
And you know, when you're out in nature or you've done psychedelics, you know, you have these experiences where you're like, oh my gosh, what we see, what's that analogy of the iceberg, right? Titanic, it's like
Yeah.
the iceberg, 2/3 of the iceberg is underneath
Yeah.
the water, what we don't see.
Yeah.
And so it's really trying to move past, right, the physical, although
Yeah.
we're in the physical and we have to use the physical. But I think COVID is maybe helping some people search more deeply to understand their connection to all that is, where we're going,
Mm.
you know,
Yeah. Certainly when there are difficult times, you know, unfortunately, I wish it
for
didn't
sure.
take such difficult times. I wish there wasn't COVID in that sense for us to, take stock of things. You talk about imaginary friends, or we both were talking about it. Yeah, I agree. I think a child's imaginary friends are imaginary in the same way that this also is imaginational, let's say,
Hmm
right? I can see
hmm
the fridge behind you, the kitchen behind you. You can see the desk behind me. This is also imaginational. Imaginational. We're doing an interpretation right now, which is why I think acting is a great thing to talk about. We're in a scene in our
Yes,
own way.
that's right. And also, to take that another step further, somebody, again, from the creative to the translating it into the physical, the material, somebody had the imagination for that desk you have there. Like somebody
Yeah.
created
Yeah.
from ideation into
Yeah.
the physical, right? So
Yeah.
it's all creative. That's which is really cool.
And
Uh,
it's almost like they've created a set. We've
yeah,
created a
that's
set
right.
here, right?
Yeah.
When I was a kid, we used to sometimes do dramas. I used to be in plays, and my parents were really into it. And my father would build some of the props, so we would act out some of the scenes from Hindu mythology. And they're very
Okay. Oh
elaborate, and
yeah, yeah, yeah.
you have like weapons and things that we don't have around these days. So, I remember there's a weapon called a gada, which is like it's kind of like a club with a big end. So we bought this plastic pumpkin that became the end of it and wrapped aluminum foil around it, stuck it to a baseball bat, and it became this kind of weapon for the set. But in a way, when you talked about the desk, it's the same thing. It's
Mm,
somebody had this idea and was like, okay, I need a flat platform to write on. It's got to be steady, but okay, I think four legs would be best. Why? Well, animals have four legs, we have four limbs, so that's what's coming to me. Let me put four limbs on this thing too. And we're literally creating out of our experience this set in which we live.
that's so true. Also, if you were a kid and you were acting out the Mahabharata, like that probably lasted for those were long ass plays you were doing. My God. Indian poems are like 20 years long. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, we never did the whole Mahabharata.
Okay.
You're right. I would still be
Okay.
acting right now.
You
But
would be. That's
yeah, I
amazing.
wasn't good enough to last that long. But the things that we did do were they're very meaningful, and especially the creation of sets, I think, speaks to that.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that came to me is you mentioned cliches, and I agree with you 100%. Um, one of the cliches that I thought was the most cliche, perhaps, growing up was be yourself. And today, I find that to be the most profound advice.
And it's
Um,
so hard.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
also that's really what I teach, right?
yeah,
Like we think, touching back on the acting part, like when we watch a movie or a TV show, people who aren't people who aren't in the acting process, you're following a story written um, with a plot line and different characters and different situations at different time in a different period, right? And sometimes it's autobiographical or biographical, and sometimes it's completely fictional. But the point is the person who is watching it subjectively is kind of imprinting on the story who they think these people are, just like life. Again, I don't know you, so I imprint my own. I'm filling in the blanks of who I think you are. And so
yeah,
I think sometimes people mistake that when they're watching something that the actor is playing this character, and at one level they are, but at a much deeper level they're actually just playing themselves within the context of the story,
mm,
right? So I just started watching The Crown. I'm so late to the game, and the acting is so wonderful, and they are obviously playing characters based on real people. But the woman playing Princess Diana is not doing an imitation of Princess Diana. She's finding her own princessness
yeah,
within herself. And
yeah,
that's why it's so real. And yes, you have the wig and you watch like uh, you know, archival footage of Diana so you understand maybe how, again, but how she lived or how she moved. But then the actor has to translate that again into their own system. And so I think that the hardest thing of the journey that we're all on is the calling to be ourselves. And we live in a world that is telling us, it tells us to be yourself, but it really doesn't. I think it's a very weird, I don't know, disconnect. Like that's what we're told, but it doesn't really reward that in many ways because we live in a sheep people kind of mentality,
yeah,
right? To go your own path is very scary. To trust your own instinct, you might be, Joseph Campbell talks about it's like the Iliad or the Odyssey. You have to go on your hero's journey, and that can't happen if you don't authentically go into the underworld of yourself.
yeah.
And this is why we're driven by distraction and we ignore and we check out. And I have my own challenges with it. We all do. I'm not judging it, but I find that working with actors, it's really amazing to get them to trust that who they are is enough, interesting, beautiful, human, scary, weird, messed up, divine, like all of it, right?
I had this
And as
conversation with a couple people many years ago,
mm,
and we were talking about when an actor acts, are they, oh yeah, exactly what you said. are they actually playing a character? Are they inventing a character that they're playing? Or is it that they're bringing this aspect of themselves out?
Yeah, the latter. That's it.
It's the latter, huh?
Yeah, which is really hard. Again, I think we think that acting is about putting all this stuff on, and like life, when we hang out with those people, there we don't, maybe you're attracted to it at first, but then when the other shoe drops and you see who the person really is, it's a charade. You're not interested. It's not real. So we are, again, at a deeper level, when we respond to really authentic performance, I think we're connected to the core of that kind of honesty. They're really living in the simple truth of what it means to be human.
Hmm.
And I think when we see the bells and whistles, you're immediately out. I also think what's interesting, like, I use the crown, but because that's maybe a lot of most of the things that actors are going to do are not based on real people, right? So they're originating a role as themselves. So if you go and see a movie that's fictionalized, to me what's exciting is the person who got cast in that role, they're originating it. So they're doing it the way they imagine it, want it to be, like their own DNA is all over that, right? But then a different actress who had maybe gotten cast in it could have done it a different way, right? And if we compared the two, whatever that means, you see similarities in our human struggles and foibles, and then you see difference because each of us is different, right?
Hmm.
So that, but again, I think like, for me, is getting people, myself on my own journey of trusting our own individual journeys,
Hmm.
of and
Yeah.
simplifying into who I am. And it can be lonely sometimes because you feel like, oh gosh, the rest of the world is saying it's blue, and I always thought it was red. Oh, I shouldn't use blue and red. Sorry. Take two. Right, that was
Right.
like terrible.
Right.
But you know what I'm saying.
Yeah. Yeah.
I really, those are just colors that came to my mind. I
Yeah.
swear to goodness, anybody who's watching this, I wasn't thinking in terms of politics, but it's hard to trust our own way when everything we see and read and hear about seems to be like all the cool kids are over here,
Yeah.
you know?
I experienced some of that in my own work because in
Oh, for
medicine,
sure.
you know, I trained in medicine and allopathic medicine. It's the most common form of medicine around the world. And yet much of what I see, how I was raised and what I see myself is a different version of the human being. And the question is, how do we reconcile, this version of anatomy and physiology that I learned in medical school, let's say, with the whole human, right? The two people that are here, for example, and there's much more in the latter. The former is part of the latter, but the latter is not captured by the former. So how do we reconcile that? And when you talk about that in medicine, it often becomes a challenging conversation because you have to move outside our area of expertise, right?
Mm-hmm,
As a
mm-hmm.
physician, we are supposed to be the experts on, for example, the body and on physiology, and we are from a particular perspective on anatomy. But if we have to expand that perspective, it becomes difficult. So I've met some of those same challenges that you're talking about.
Well, I think you do it so well. Like that's how we connected because an actor, student of mine, or somebody connected, showed me or sent me one of your videos, and I watched, and I was like, oh, you're really integrating the anatomy, physiology, the science part with another different way of thinking about science,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Yeah.
and trying to, so that was interesting, but also I'm sure it's hard, like you said, because the medical profession, the establishment is so steeped in what has come before, like where the science has led them, and
Yeah.
it's so traditional. And so
Yeah.
to break, and it's great because it's scientifically, empirically proven, I guess. Although one could argue, is it? Because isn't the scientific, look at me trying to be like, I'm gonna like get into the science. No, but it's fascinating because you can maybe help explain it better. But the whole point about, what do you call it? When you're doing a scientific experiment, the scientific experiment is prejudiced, a bias based on the person who's conducting the experiment, right? So there is always going to be the X factor, or so it's, so that also, to me, the implication of, I don't know, there's so many ways of interpreting the data,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, very
It's
much
so
so. And
cool.
the science that we do, the experiments that we do, have a base in, let's call it philosophy. And by philosophy, I simply mean the way we define things. Like we might say, we're studying this. Why are we studying it? Well, to help a human being. Well, how are we defining that human being? If we're
Mm,
defining it primarily physically, then we're going to get different results for that experiment than if we have a broader definition. And then what is that based on? Let's say our philosophy. We don't have to be philosophers, but our basic approach to how we define things and how we think about things, what is that based on? Well, it's based on our perception and it's
mm,
based on our experiences. So what ultimately becomes science starts with our fundamental experiences of identity, of relationship, of perception, that becomes formed into some kind of philosophy, either formally or informally, mostly informally, because nobody most researchers are not talking about philosophy. We don't talk about our philosophical biases that precede our science. But from that philosophy, which is usually a materialist philosophy, which is that body comes first, physicality is primary, and mind is this kind of offshoot that body creates.
mm,
From that
mhm.
philosophy, now we conduct science. So yes, just like you said, science is very good at telling us about measurements, about reproducibility, about predictability. We also have to understand the assumptions that go into it and the perceptions that go into it.
I think, Anoop, like what you're talking about is the scientist, him or herself, is influencing the outcome of an experiment, right?
Yeah,
Based on what they want to see, their expectations, which
yeah,
then has, to me, it begs the question, what is our role in creating our reality? You know what I mean? And
yeah,
I don't know, it's just really fascinating. Like I listen
yeah,
to a lot of science podcasts and most of the stuff goes way over my head, but it's a lot of obviously, it's to me it's all interconnected
yeah,
and it is really fascinating
yeah.
to to me also when you have oh my god, what do you call it when oh my gosh, there's the name for it, the scientific term for it. It will come to me. But like if I hadn't talked to you in 4 years and all of a sudden I think of you
Yeah,
and then you call me that day
yeah, yeah.
and what is it? Oh my god.
Coincidence or synchronicity
Well,
or
no, well, that's how I would call it, but there's also a very scientific way to explain it, but it will come to me. But
okay.
I just find this is kind of I dabble in all of this, you know what I
Yeah,
mean?
yeah,
And I think it has something to do with also being plugged into other information, if you
yeah,
will,
yeah, yeah, yeah. I hear you.
I have it in my new book. I have this, everybody's kind of, not everybody, but a lot of my students have been obsessed with the ayahuasca stories
Ah,
I've told because I
yeah.
went and did ayahuasca like 15 years ago.
Okay.
But mind you, I've been to India a number of times. I've been meditating very committedly for, oh my gosh, since 1998. So same thing, over 20 years, right?
Mhm.
And so again, I find them all to sort of be coalescing in the same
Mhm.
way. But I, I guess the ayahuasca experience was revealing again in that sense that what we think we're perceiving is just one little tiny part of the
Yes,
big
yes, very true.
enchilada. Yeah,
Very true. I mean, even even two people looking at the same thing see it from a slightly
that's
different
right.
angle,
Different
slightly
way.
different
Yeah, that's right.
shades,
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
that's with no other influences, right? We see that. And then if you look at how we perceive, ultimately there are visual stimuli that go back to the retina, to the optic nerve, to the brain, and then the brain does something, we don't quite understand what. It takes that electrochemical impulse and then an image appears,
Mm,
right? This image
hmm.
just kind of appears. So, what is that process that's happening by which we actually interpret this world? Because everything that we're interpreting is the result here of reflected light. Like the light is reflecting from your screen and coming to you. But what about the original light
Mm,
prior to reflection and
hmm.
the original light prior to interpretation? What is this world prior to interpretation? And it goes back to the set that we're building merely by the act of perceiving, which is like me moving my eyes to hear. That very process, there is a mechanism in play that interprets then what is here, that builds the set as I'm looking here, as other stimuli reach my ears, it's building an auditory set, a visual set, right? There's these overlapping sets is then what we call our reality.
Experience. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
I mean, I guess it makes us think about what do we want to be focusing on. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
I mean,
Yes.
and that's, I guess that's also part of our journey. Like, it's so easy, especially during such challenging times. I, you know, it's really, how do I focus on, or I think maybe, to me, sometimes what I think is really challenging on Instagram or in social media is I'm really always trying to find an inspiring way to look at the challenges we face, because
Yeah.
inherently the solutions to all these problems are also here. They're not on another planet. We do not have to go to Mars. Do you know what I mean? Which is, to me, insane. But I think the world is so embedded with, from the plant world on, like, we have the solutions to things, right? But where was I going with this? Oh, I guess so. When I'm posting about things that we have to become aware of, I find it fascinating that a lot of the social media world is obsessed with toxic positivity, which is not solution oriented, which is not really taking a look at the problem.
Yeah.
And therein, when I look at my life, although yes, it'd be great to be problem free, the beautiful thing is every single challenge has held an answer, an offshoot of a new possibility for me, has ultimately created a win, right? If you're willing to, again, go down into the shadow part of it or look
Yeah.
at it.
Yeah.
So I think I think it's just important that we don't get anesthetize ourselves with the social mediaing of, like, everything is always so amazing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. I actually talked about this yesterday. I did a short video
Oh,
on
okay.
bliss. I called it Beyond Bliss, a reality check, because so much, especially in the spirituality, we hear a lot about bliss. And yes, bliss is an important aspect of life. I think there's a bliss body, like a part of our anatomy
Yes,
that
yes,
is
yes.
blissful, but that's different from always remaining as
Happiness.
bliss.
Yes,
Yes.
yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes. That's
And
right.
I like what you said earlier about it makes us think about what we want to focus on, right? Yes, it's wonderful to experience bliss. Then how do we go from there? How do we bring that into this world? How do we acknowledge the challenges that are real and not just try to positivize everything, I suppose, but use the positivity. I mean, there
Mm.
are real deep resources that every human being has access to. And then how do we bring that and translate it here, as you talked about earlier, in terms of bringing our imagination into the physical, for example.
Well, I love that you call it bliss body. I'm
Yeah.
gonna, like, take that.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
will give you credit.
Oh yeah.
Anoop Kapoor, Bliss Body. Anoop Kapoor's
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Bliss Body, because it's so true. Anoop, I was saying something yesterday in class. I often call it joy, right? But, like, it is like this. It's very difficult to articulate because it's not about. So yes, finding this, how do you, this foundational aspect of who we are as human beings, as spirit, as whatever we want to call it, is vibrating at a place of joy.
Yeah.
The existence itself is humming with, again, maybe joy isn't even, or bliss, how do we use words to describe
Right. Right.
the energy of life?
Right.
It's so moving to me. It's life. And it's not to say that life isn't full of heartache and pain and struggle and grief. I'm not saying to bypass that, but underneath that, sometimes when I get really challenged, it's, or watch something or hear something that is so painful, it's not to ignore the pain and yeah, that's insanity.
Right.
But it's also appreciating the
Yeah.
interlockingness of it all.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that's hard for people to get beyond the happiness part. It's not about happiness.
Yeah.
Happiness is, right, a changeable state that occurs, like, well, I'm happy right now because I have really good coffee in my shamwari mug
Yeah.
from, South Africa, and this makes me happy. But that's, you know what I'm saying?
Right.
Happiness is maybe on a gradation of a number of things, including pain and grief, that
Yes.
are part of joy or
Yeah.
bliss.
Yes. I
Oh my
agree.
God, I love the way you're sharing all this with people.
Yeah. I mean, I think I think there are layers to the human being, and bliss body is not mine.
Bliss
It's
body.
thousands of years old.
That's
I'm
right.
translating it somewhat, but as we go deeper into the layers of the human being, at a very fundamental layer, there is an ocean of bliss, and that's not restricted to the body. and it kind of
Mm,
perturbs itself in a way to
mhm,
construct the
mhm,
body, if we might put it
mhm,
that way. And beyond that is a, let's just say, a simplicity or an awareness in which even pain is allowed. It's not that, it's not that we have to rail against pain, or even all these polar opposites and all shades of everything and light and dark, and all of this has a place. And again, I think acting is such a beautiful way to experience and or to talk about that. You talked about what is the word? What is the word that we use? And that reminds me of script writing. It's like we're always writing scripts, but we, in our case, we're, as human beings, we're performing the script as we're writing it.
mm,
We're
mhm,
writing and performing the script simultaneously. And sometimes we need to go back and look at our words and be like, wait, I performed this a little bit too quickly. And I
mm.
think that happens over time as we get used to words, as I think happens in spirituality when we talk about bliss in certain contexts or happiness in certain contexts.
Yeah, well, I guess we get stuck on the words, right? But
Yeah.
I think what just jumped out to me when you were saying that is also thinking about why I love acting is, it's the oldest profession or the second oldest profession. But I think it is such a trying to share an expression or an experience with humanity back with itself to better understand or figure out or create meaning. But I do find like it's so fascinating because even though I teach this philosophy or belief of like non-acting acting, right? It's just being, which is super hard to just be. But then uh, conversely, we're all acting all the time in life. As Shakespeare said, oh God, I'm gonna like bludgeon this, but from it's not The Tempest, but we're here and we're playing a very dramatic. I'm a terrible acting teacher. I can't even remember from what play it is. Not Much Ado. I think
Are you
everything.
talking about All the World's a Stage?
Yes, yes.
Okay, yeah.
It's
I don't
like
know. I don't know where it's from. I'm sorry.
it's not The Tempest. It's not Much Ado, but Midsummer maybe. But anyway, yes, we play our roles dramatically, and then we're
Yeah.
carried off the wings, right? And I think we forget maybe sometimes when I get too serious about life, I forget in context the great drama that it is, and that I'm playing like the tiniest role, although it's significant for me and also people that I am connecting with,
Yeah.
but it's just a role,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And
And
again, these are like
go ahead.
it,
Go
it
ahead.
takes a lot of it it takes some working through it to
Yeah.
have those ahas about it, which is really cool. Can I
Yeah.
just say really quickly, I want to hear what you say, but I'm listening to this Audible book called Kindred,
Hmm.
which is all about the lives of our Neanderthal grandmothers and grandfathers. It's so fascinating because I'm really interested in like the archaeological aspect of where we come
Yeah.
from a physical place, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And it also just puts everything in perspective, like also like again the mythology, like how when I was in school, what I thought Neanderthals were like dumb cavemen, brutes,
Right. Right.
oh, I'm going to hit you over the head and
Right.
carry you. Like they were so amazingly sophisticated and brilliant. I mean, if you think about it, they had to be in order to survive 350,000 years. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah.
It's mind blowing to
Yeah.
me,
Yeah.
and it also helps to contextualize our unimportance or our place in this journeying.
Yeah. It certainly gives that. It gives that relative picture where we are relative to other civilizations. Yeah.
But
I think
I think
about.
also, oh, go ahead.
Well, it reminds me of the question of whether we are an advanced civilization or not. And there's
Ah,
so many ways
oh,
to answer that. Go ahead.
no, I love it. Like we're totally in simpatico.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say, like, for me, what I get excited about listening to that book is also my being right here, right now. I'm helping move culture forward. I'm helping move the line of Homo sapiens forward. Like
Yeah.
it's really so everybody listening, you are an integral part of
Yeah.
this amazing thing. We're all connected,
Yeah.
right? But what were you just saying that I just had this big aha about? Oh, you were talking about
Whether we're an
uh,
advanced civilization.
yeah, like again, I think like we're taught things or told things that aren't really accurate. And so we spin, I don't know, like for me, I always had like, when I think about past lives or like, I don't have a lot of past life experiences or anything like that. But I always am like, oh my God, if I have to come back, if you believe in like alternate, yet like all realities are happening at the same time. I was like, oh, I would never want to come back and like the Wild West, or I'm just making something up, because what we've been told, it was like wild and
Yeah.
dirty and like you're being murdered all the time. But then you find out actually that's Hollywood's depiction of it. It was
Right.
actually, I mean, life was hard, but life is still hard. You know what I mean? But
Yeah.
you weren't being murdered by gunslingers every 2 seconds.
Yeah.
So it's again, the narrative is
Yeah.
so off.
Yeah.
Is that
That's
what
really
you were going to
powerful.
say? I don't know. I just jumped in, but
That's
it made me excited.
Well, it's a good place to go. I don't know if that was what I was going to say, but yeah, the narrative is so powerful. Narrative is so powerful, which is one of the reason I like to do these conversations with
Mm,
people of different backgrounds, because we need a more full story. Our stories are so skeletal at this point, and then everybody thinks that that's the story, so everybody's left out, it seems like.
totally. Like the story that we want to perpetuate, the story that helps certain segments of society. You
Yeah,
know, for so long, it's been the white person's story who's been the colonizer and, you know, the murderer, really, if we want to be honest, right? Where are the stories of, you know, this is why Black Lives Matter is at so many different levels, right? Because where is the Black experience in the history that isn't being taught? You know, it hasn't been taught.
yeah,
But women's story, I mean, we can go on and on and on, right? Like having a better, I mean, that just kind of speaks to the colonization of like the white story that has always been, you know, as opposed to the human story. I'm not saying white stories shouldn't be told.
yeah,
I'm writing from my perspective as a gay. I don't think of myself in terms of whiteness, I guess, but of course that's a part of who I am. But
yeah,
my point is, I'm trying to tell universal stories from my perspective that
yeah,
are inclusive.
yeah,
But you're right, like the the very nature of existence that has lived for millennia has been through storytelling,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
But somewhere along the line it's been augmented to fit somebody else's political idea, you know,
yeah,
control of what the story should be.
yeah,
Religion has been a big, oh my God. I mean,
yeah.
don't get me started.
Yeah, and I don't think we realize today. I think because of the success of science and how much technology we have, and there's a narrative that we are a very advanced civilization. And I think because of this, we don't realize that we primarily communicate and build our lives around storytelling, just as we always have done. Even science, as we talked about the assumptions
Mm,
that are built in, technology, what kind of technology do we develop? What do we call technology? Yesterday, I had a conversation with somebody. We were talking about technology. He was talking about augmented reality, virtual reality. And I said, wait a second, let's also consider who created this technology. It's the human being. Like, why do we not see ourselves as very advanced kinds of technology? I'm
mm,
not saying that means we're machines,
mhm,
but we
mhm.
are incredibly advanced. And sometimes we need to shift our attention away from only the things we are creating to what it is that is creating them, which is
Mm,
ourselves, and
mhm.
have a greater appreciation for that and tell that story.
Yeah, the engineering, like we are the engineers and the engineering of it, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah,
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
I think the medical scientific community needs more people like you. I'm sure there are more and more people like anything that do think about things like this, right?
Yeah,
As we continue to forge forward on
yeah.
this interesting journey.
So let me get your take on in acting, you have a person bringing out different roles from within themselves, right?
Hmm.
Sounds like that
Hmm.
might be right.
That's right.
So how do you see, let's say a person has a daydream. Let's say I have a daydream now, and now I've created this other character that's also me in this daydream,
Okay.
and my identity is moving into that role of that character in the daydream.
Okay. But we'll say it again. But then, so you have a daydream of how you think this person looks. Is that what you kind of help
No,
me translate it in a way that I can
yeah.
answer?
So let's say I'm imagining myself riding a bike. right? I'm having
Okay.
a daydream. I'm sitting
Okay.
in class, the professor's droning on, and I'm kind of half here, half not. And now
Right.
I've created this world, right? So in this world, I'm bicycling. It's a windy day. I can feel the wind brushing against my face. And speak to me a little bit about identity in this context, because there's some identity as this guy in class who's bored, and there's some identity as this cyclist and playing a role.
Yes, I guess where I would take that is as if we're talking from a place of imagination,
Hmm.
that an imagination can create identity, but what I'm always helping actors understand is the imagination process is part of a creative process. But like anything, when we talk about technology, an idea, you want to move to you dream about islands or whatever, and but okay, well, if you want to live an island life, you're going to have to pick up practically. You're going to have to pick up, pack your suitcase, sell your house, buy a plane ticket, move to Fiji, right? So I think for me, if I'm getting your exploring correctly, is the ideation part is a part of creativity, but I think it's a subtler if, in terms of acting. I think I always kind of teach know it and then throw it. So we have to trust that our systems are more connected and more knowledgeable, if you will, than our brain's analysis or interpretation of it. And so if I'm doing a scene then, and that image came to me and it gives me insight into how I want to explore the character, I can't show that, because if I'm showing that, I'm all of a sudden going to start acting it. It's going to be false, right? But once I have that, it's a part of me, just like grief is, just like the feelings we were talking about earlier. It's all inside me, whether you've experienced it or not. It's also universally, I'm always saying, the universe is contained within us and we are contained within the universe. So I have to, at some level, trust everything I'm ever going to need is inside me and it's firing out at some level. But that then again is, to me, Anoop, is removing the restrictions that keep us from expressing it, right?
Hmm.
I think, like, to me, I don't know if I answer that exactly right in terms of identity. My
No.
thing is, a lot of times what I'm helping actors do less of is play their idea. And identity can is an or maybe identity is a better word, their identification of what they think that person looks like. I just had this girl
Mm.
self-tape for, and self-taping just means they're putting themselves on camera and recording it to send to casting, right, to see if they're right for the job. And this woman is really amazing and very talented, and she was going in for this new revival of this British series, and she's supposed to play the character is a rich royal, so kind of like a monarch, like part of the monarchy, right? And but it's not the crown, but something like that. So when I was watching her, I was like, I'll just make up her name, Bernadette. I was like, I mean, I can use her real name, but I was like, Bernadette, why you're really, like, she wasn't free. There was a level of acting going on, like, that I've not seen her do. And she said, oh gosh, she said, because the description, so the identity that is described for the actor in these little stage briefs of what they're looking for, describe this character as rich and royal. So in her mind now, she's playing an idea of what rich and royal looks like. That creates acting. Rich and royal, I told her, I was like, even royals shit. Like, you know what I mean? It's not what we think it is. All people are this kaleidoscope, or like you said, these the prisms of light that are bouncing off us and through us and around us. So it's so much more of a multiplicitous universe than it is a one-dimensional identification with, oh, that's how somebody looks.
Yeah.
Does that make
So
sense? I mean, I
yeah, it
kind of
does make
over
sense.
explain that. You were probably
No,
like,
no, I
oh
see
my
what you're
God.
saying.
But
No,
but
not at
but
all. Not at all. Let
I
me
feel
see if
like,
I can go ahead.
as a super smart person you are, I feel like, oh God, I gotta really like make sure
No,
like I'm like meeting you at your level of intellect.
no, no. I like the way you're integrating everything. Let me see if I can tie it back into that and explore more. I mean, there are no right or wrong answers here. We're
Yeah,
just
no, no,
kind
no,
of
that's
adding
great.
the stuff around. So in the case of a daydream, what's interesting to me is that I'm not trying to play that guy who's riding the bicycle, right? He's in a way playing himself. Like
That's right.
that which was brought out of this character, it was brought out of that character, and that guy is now just being himself.
That's
And
right.
yet it's rooted in this identity here somehow. So I think it just speaks to the transferability, how easily we can transfer identity, we take on roles. And I
Mm,
think that maybe naturalness and 100% being in that character is in a way perhaps what you're trying to teach, is just like
mhm.
being that character without having to think what that character is like.
That's right. And something else that just came to mind when you were describing that, again, at a deeper level, to understand we're connected, all those things. When you're seeing yourself in an image on a bike, what else do you equate with that? Freedom, wind blowing through your hair, like you smell the sea, or there's like this, I don't know, there's je ne sais quoi of like, it's
Yeah,
just, it's
right,
buoyant, right?
right.
So maybe it's even less about identifying with how something looks and more of like, oh, I'm dialed into like what the feeling part feels like. But
Yeah,
again, then you have to let the thing that I think actors sometimes misrepresent is then like life, whatever is happening in the moment is going to then affect our feelings. So I could be a very buoyant, fun, riding my bike kind of guy, but then all of a sudden you tell me, if you and I are in a scene and we're married and you tell me you want a divorce, that's
yeah,
going to change me. The
yeah,
problem is, Anoop, is sometimes actors will ignore the moment or the truth of what that moment may mean for them to play the idea. Aha, see, of the imagination or what they think this sky looks like. That's false.
mm,
That's unreal. You would, in real life, you would call someone on that. You'd be like, "Are you not listening to me? I want a
yeah,
divorce."
yeah,
You know what? Who I really, because my work is so influenced by things that you were talking about and so many of the things we've been touching on. I've also been really influenced by Malcolm Gladwell,
hmm,
and Outliers, Blink,
yeah,
David and Goliath. Like I've read so many of his books, and I don't remember which one. It's the book where he talks about 10,000 hours, I think. But one of the things he
yeah.
talks about, the tipping point.
Tipping point, right?
In the tipping point, he talks about, now he's not talking about acting, but this blew me away when I read it. He said that our character as human beings, right? Because the tipping point is about, he's a social scientist about the human condition. He was talking about, I'm using my own terms, but basically in life, our character is more born out of the circumstances we find ourselves in, partially.
Hmm.
So, who I am making love to my beloved last night is not who I'm going to be, I hope not, with my mom and dad the next morning at breakfast. That situation is evoking a different Tony.
Yeah,
But Tony robbing a bank is going to be a different Tony. And
yeah,
Tony fighting climate change is a different, see what I'm saying?
yeah, yeah,
So it's kind of a different way of saying what you were just saying
yeah,
about, you know, the integration of all these identities
yeah,
that come from our imagination and that are inside us.
yeah. And
This is the
that
deepest
also
acting podcast ever. I'm going to have to use this for my podcast.
that also speaks to me about the inseparability of the character and the scene. It's,
Yes, that's right.
it's as you said, it's like this movement where one current
The
moves,
dance,
the
the
other current
dance.
moves in accordance, and there's no separate character in a scene. The character is the scene, and the scene is the character.
That's right. It's a dance. It's like right now, you and I are podcasting. Then when we end, you're going to seamlessly move into going checking in on your son, and
Yeah,
then you're going to seamlessly move into answering emails, or
yeah,
then kissing your wife or whatever. You know what I mean?
yeah,
That's it. It's just it is, but that's also freaking hard. It's freaking hard to be in the flow or to
yeah,
trust the simplicity of it.
yeah,
You know?
yeah.
You
And
could
that
be an
reminds
acting teacher, Anu.
well, I think very much, and I see very much in these terms, in as identities, roles, scenery,
Mm-hmm.
and there are many ways to talk about it, and also very much what you said, which is like, okay, now what segment of this do I wish to focus on now? Because focusing on everything is also not acting in the world. They're both the
That's true.
same, because
Yes.
once you start to bring everything and literally everything, physicality, mentality, and beyond, now it's not in the sphere of action. It's in the sphere of, let's say, being.
That's
And
right.
to bring being into action means bringing the focus on a particular subset of existence.
That's right. I mean, the way I would describe that is in acting terms, because I've had people, you know, being confronted with this. I would call it spiritual woo-wooism. You know what I mean? Like sometimes I'm talking to someone about, well, why are you not in your rage about this moment or this scene or what the conflict is bringing up? And they want to spiritually bypass certain feelings because at one level they intellectually understand kind of what you were talking about, but it's sort of like bifurcating themselves or letting only the spiritual part dictate and deny the actual physical terrestrial, the you know, the life, blood and guts of being physical,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So, oh, I'm a spiritual being, so I don't need to get angry. Well, yes, you do, because you have not left your body yet, and life is still going to make us angry. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I also get it from that perspective of I manage in life. Tony, because of my spiritual practice, I don't really get angry about a lot of things
Right.
because I'm learning how to, but that doesn't mean in my work and in my storytelling that I'm not accessing and using it,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. I
So,
think there's a difference between um, not ever being angry about anything versus as a result of time, practice,
mm-hmm,
nature,
mm-hmm,
anger might dissipate as we
mm-hmm.
work through certain things. And yet the capacity is always there. I think that's the key, is that the capacity to respond in many ways. We never know what the next moment is going to bring. And as long as we're focusing on a subset, and I think this is the key, there's always a capacity to respond in many ways.
Well, I think what you just said again is like so specific to what I teach with acting is we don't know what is coming next. And in acting, I think why actors love acting so much, especially when they are kind of learning to work basically in our philosophy, which is living in the unknown, which is ironically what life is about. But here's my thought about this. So in acting, we love this sense of freedom and danger and not knowing what's coming next, even though we know what the lines are, or we know we're in a rehearsal process or whatever. But you're really, when you're untethered and you're free, it is like a higher, it's like a high, it's like an experience of heightened living.
Mhm.
And then we like come back into our body in a different way, and then we're like, oh god, I have to go pay the bills, or I have to go cook, or
Yeah.
like change the diapers. And
Yeah.
we let sort of the mundacity of life rob us of the unknowable.
Yeah.
And life is supposed to be like, I'm so excited talking with you because I don't know what you're going to say, and so I'm working, it's this is the way we're supposed to live. But we, myself, you, we've all been conditioned by the whatever, the machinery of culture, to turn that part, that part gets, it's lost, right? It's also based on control. I think we don't, it's, I think what COVID, it's kind of what you were speaking about earlier again. Why does it take tragedy often, personal and maybe at a bigger level, to wake us up, to live a more heightened, although albeit scary maybe right now for a lot of people,
Yeah.
and unknowability?
Yeah.
Unknowability is, again, the state of existence that we're all living in. Doesn't matter how many freaking cars you have or how much money you have. You are not able to take any of that. That stuff is not keeping you from holding on, or
Yeah.
letting go, I should say.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So this acting to me is an amazing exercise and discipline in understanding more of the science of the moment,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. And
And that's
that
what I
reminds me
teach.
of
Yeah.
that reminds me of what we were saying earlier about the bliss body. That it reminds me of um, this analogy of the high of acting that you were speaking of, and in the role, and boom, 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 one after the other. You're on the roller coaster. You're going, and then the roller coaster stops, and
Stops.
then you got to get off, and you're like, man, where's the bliss body? But I
Exactly.
think that speaks to that deeper layer of everything, of being, that actually allows no bliss too,
Mm.
that allows no no joy or no happiness or little joy or little happiness. And I think that's the speaks to what you said earlier about integrating the positivity and the negativity. And what it is that integrates that being or that space that integrates that, I don't know that it can be scripted. I don't know that it has a word,
Mm-hmm.
because it doesn't fall in the dimension of polarity. And in the good evil character story,
You're right.
what is that which accepts both?
Yes, I don't know what we would call that.
Yeah.
I was going to say maybe when we go out into nature or we are disconnected from these freaking phones and technology, we have, again, these moments of a connection to our bliss body or something other than we were talking about the high in class, and then it's over and then you have to go home and it's like womp womp. But I think when we are connected to something other than that which makes us dwell in the world of comparisons, competition, again, like, I'm not saying that all these things aren't, there are a part of culture, so they always will be, but sadly when we let those things dictate our happiness, it's hard, right? Because you'll never win, you'll never find your happiness through the thing, because the thing is always changing and moving, and somebody made it up. Who are these people? I'm always saying the inmates are running the asylum. You know what I mean?
Right.
So, I
Right.
mean, look at our government. Look at how government is run. I mean, it's kind of wacky. So, I think, how do we manage our own joy independent of events, circumstances, I think that's the challenge that we're all on,
Yeah.
because we've all also won things or gotten the thing we thought we wanted that would make us feel XYZ. And then you're like, okay, now what?
Yeah.
That's the big, I think, you know, game that culture plays with us, of like, oh, once you get this, you're going to be really happy. And it can be really dangerous to young people, because then you get it and then you're like, well, I'm not happy. That my happiness isn't in that thing. I know you know this, but it's always important to reiterate, right?
Yeah.
Like, our joy, our bliss is in life itself, again.
Yeah.
And these things are wonderful to have. I'm not saying people should not go for getting a girlfriend or
Right.
or whatever, but
Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
Listen, this is such a great conversation, because even though I teach these things, I always have to be freaking reminded of it. And like, I'm working through it
Yeah.
all the time. I
Yeah.
was just going to say too, like, if I can real quick, like,
Mhm.
for 25 years, I've never really named, I don't want to reduce what I do, in acting circles. Through 100 years, they call, a lot of teachers call their thing a method, right? Like,
Okay.
Stella Adler or Stanislavski, and I'm not saying they weren't great teachers, but I've never wanted to reduce what I teach to one thing, because that makes it fixed
Mhm.
and immovable and unchangeable. And what we're talking about speaks to the fluidity of stuff.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
did come across a Brene Brown quote, and I was like, oh my God, this really encapsulates what I teach, because she talks about the nature of vulnerability, which is to be vulnerable also at the same time means to be courageous or brave,
Mhm.
which is living in emotional uncertainty without knowing the outcome, and emotional exposure. And that's basically acting. And that is life, right? We're all walking the walk of, whether we realize it or not, of emotional vulnerability. And that takes guts, it takes bravery. Now, we can cover it up with all kinds of control mechanisms, but that's the core of who we are as human
Yeah.
beings.
Yeah.
So, I don't know, it's so exciting to think about it in all these ways.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining me in this exploration.
Anoop, that was so amazing. You could come be a guest teacher at my acting
Oh,
studio.
I'd love to. Let me know. We've scratched the surface of identity. I'm
Oh
happy
my
to
God.
dive more into it.
I mean, I hope, yeah, I mean, I think you're really inspiring. I was so inspired today. And I'd love to use this for my own podcast, since you recorded, if I can, after you
Sure, I'll
post
send it
it.
to you. I'll send
Because
it to you.
it's so, I mean, you're saying so many great things. And I just think it's so inspiring. So,
Thank you. So if people want to learn more about you, get your book, listen to your podcast, how do we do that?
well, I guess, because you're going to post this on Instagram, right? So, like, this is, I'm on Instagram at Anthony Meindl, and I'm sure you're going to have all that. And my book is called You Knew When You Were Two, my latest book. It's on Amazon. All my books are on Amazon.
Okay.
And my podcast is on everywhere podcasts can be found.
Is there a
SoundCloud.
website with all of these?
Yeah, and then you can find me at www.anthonymeindl.com.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Thank you for the
Thanks, Anthony. I
shout
appreciate
out.
it.
Thanks so much for having me.